Hi, I'm Kaushik Roy. I'm a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Purdue University, and today I'll talk about computing with neural-inspired learning, and in particular I'll talk about the entire design stack, going all the way from sensors, algorithms to hardware architecture. Deep learning certainly has made a huge amount of progress in the recent past, and if you open up any tech news today, you find some achievements of deep learning. And as an example, the one that I really like the most is AI won an art contest, and the human artists are furious about it. Now, the question, of course, is, such an achievement is made at a cost of humongous amount of energy. So to that effect, we actually did some analysis of the energy cost of AI. And one of my colleagues here at Purdue did this estimation. So if I were to really think about, use of AI chatbots, in particular, actually the energy use of AI chatbots, and assuming that there are about 2 billion users of AI chatbots. And if they do have 5 queries per user per day, 365 days per year, and with the fact that the energy consumption per query is about 0.0012 to zero point zero 0.01 kilowatts per query, turns out then that the total energy consumption is about 3.65 to about 36.5 terawatt hours. So what does that correspond to? That's a huge number. And if you do an analysis of it, it turns out it's equivalent to about 5 Hoover dams. So what it really tells you is that it's a humongous amount of energy. Now, on the other side of it, if you think about AI and compare that to the biological systems, despite the tremendous progress that we talked about, that AI has made, the biological systems still possess a level of functionality that is unmatched in these artificial systems. So to that effect, we actually considered a fruit fly, which has about 100,000 neurons. They certainly, as we all know, they fly fast, avoiding obstacles in cluttered environments, and dodge dynamic objects really well. And what we wanted to do in one of our projects is to actually fly drones, just maybe to fly like a fly. It certainly didn't achieve the kind of agility the fly has, but we actually, our collaborators at UPenn implemented what's called a flying monkey, and that actually had about 1 to 2 watts of compute power. Whereas if you look at the fruit fly, the compute power is in the range of microwatts. Now, going further, it turns out that if you go up the chain from the fruit fly to, let's say, a dog, or to the human beings, turns out the power consumption of the dog's brain is about zero point 0.5 watts or so. Compared that to the Spot Boston Dynamics robot, that's about 15 watts of compute power. And again, up the chin, the human, the consensus is about 20 watts of power consumption. Whereas if you try to actually look at how much was the power consumption for the Go game, it was in the range of about 10 to the 6 watts or so. So there's still a long way to go. So we also did another analysis looking at the efficiency gap. And in this particular case, we did a case study on object recognition in a smart glass with the state-of-the-art accelerator like a Google Edge TPU. And we implemented a RetinaNet DNN on this Google Edge TPU, and wanted to figure out under ideal conditions what would be the lifetime of the battery. So it turns out under ideal conditions, it was about 64 minutes or about an hour or so. Now, if you do consider all the non-idealities, which includes actually display power and so on, then the time to die for the battery is probably going to be half an hour or so. Now, that's sort of unsustainable. Now, the question, of course, is where do these inefficiencies come from? We at least certainly have an existential proof that the brain is efficient. And the reason why we have these inefficiencies probably come from the fact that we don't really know the exact algorithms in the brain. The hardware architecture of the brain is certainly quite different from what the von Neumann architecture is. We do not have, on one side of our brain a compute unit, on the other side of to be memory. They're all mixed together in some interesting ways. And finally, the circuits and devices that we use today are CMOS devices. They're certainly the workhorse of today's electronics. However, they're good switches, but may not implement this, neurons and synaptic operations very effectively. So to that effect, if you are to really develop a neuromorphic system, there's a need to really think about the entire design stack, as I mentioned. And that goes all the way from sensing to the learning algorithms or the network architecture. And these network architectures have to be implemented in the right kind of hardware. And finally, at the end of it, these hardware really consist of circuits and proper devices that can really hopefully energy efficiently implement some of these algorithms. Now the question is, in order to do well, I feel that there's a need to really think about some cues that we can take from the brain and to make them more efficient. So what are the different cues that one can potentially take? One can certainly think about the neuron model of the brain, if we can use the proper neuron model, the learning algorithms, the network topology, or in fact even the computing principles of the brain. So go into a little more details of it, what are the different cues that one can take, one can certainly try to use the right kind of neuron model. So what are the neuron models? I mean, one can potentially use the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the neuron, but also one can simplify things and say, hey, can I use the leaky integrate and fire kind of operation? Or for that matter, can I use, for example, a sigmoidal activation operation of the neuron, the ReLU, and so on. On the other side of it, the question that comes up is that, what kind of learning algorithms should we use? Today, deep learning certainly uses backpropagation for learning, and backpropagation has a good theory behind it. However, it is quite expensive in terms of the computation that it needs to do and the time and effort required to do the training. It has been also observed in the brain that some local learning occurs. The question, of course, is that, hey, can I do efficient local learning? Could be something like a spike time independent plasticity and so on. Now, also on the other side of it, turns out that we humans, when we do object recognition, we do something called foveation and saccades. I'll go into a little more details of it. The question is that, can I effectively use glimpses of foveation and along with our rapid eye movement to do better recognition and object detection? Now, this next question, of course, is what is a network topology? There's a good amount of work that has been done in the area of the visual cortex of monkeys, and people have a good understanding of the visual cortex. The question, of course, is that, so should our network architectures be similar to that? Should I have long-range connections? Should I have backward connections and so on? Feedback connections and so on. And finally, what kind of computing principles should I use for the brain? Should the compute and the memory units be very tightly integrated or be able to do some sort of in-memory computing that is sort of observed in the brain? Or should it be, should our computations be asynchronous, event-driven? And at the end of it, there's also need to think about what kind of sensing technology that we're using or what kind of sensors we're using. Should I use some sort of coding, input coding for these inputs? Should they be rate coded, time-based coded, or in some cases, maybe we can use direct analog inputs, or more recently, there's been a lot of work on DVS inputs, which is dynamic vision sensor cameras, and I'll talk about that. So with that in mind, let's try to look at the neuron models and the learning algorithms. So what kind of neuron model one can use? And as I mentioned earlier, I'm showing here the biological neuron, and one can also think about having the neuron functionality to be driven by a bunch of inputs that are coming into the neuron, and as the inputs come in, the membrane potential of the neuron goes up, and if there are no spikes which are coming in, then beyond a certain point, the membrane potential starts dropping, leaking in other words. And then when you have a large set of inputs that come in, what happens is the membrane potential goes up, and beyond a certain point, it goes beyond a threshold and it fires. So that can be certainly represented as an RC equation, like a C dVdt that I'm showing here as an leaky integrate and fire equation. Now, one can make some approximations and say, hey, maybe I should not use the leak information, make it simpler, have an integrate and fire neuron. And it turns out in a lot of cases, such a neuron could be quite effective. Finally, I'm showing another neuron, which is basically, again, a stochastic activation of this neuron. In other words, this neuron in this particular case activates stochastically and given by stochastic sigmoid function shown here. The reason I'm showing this particular neuron is that that has similarities with some of the devices that one can look at, including the magnetic devices. They have a switching characteristics that look like that, and can they directly be used for neuronal activation. And finally, there's been a good amount of work we're probably all familiar with that people have looked at in the area of having ReLU as a neuron activation. Deep learning widely uses that, or can also have tan hyperbolic kind of activation function for the neurons. And that's exactly what is used today in standard deep learning. Now, going a little bit further, the question is that, hey, what kind of network architecture is going to be useful? That's an interesting area, and what I'm showing here is some of the work that our collaborators as a part of this Center for Brain-Inspired Computing actually looked at something called the Brain Score, where the researchers at MIT DiCarlo's lab, they actually probed the monkey brain and figured out, they showed the monkey a bunch of images, and when the monkey recognized those images, they will be given a reward, and they will actually figure out the activations of these neurons. And on the other side of it, which is shown at the bottom, is basically the standard neural networks. Could be a ANN, a standard ANN, and they wanted to actually match the activations of these neuronal activities that you've seen in the monkey brain, the V1, V2, V4, and the IT of the brain, and then they try to match it with, do a regression analysis and try to match it with, for example, the standard ANN like a VGG16 or a ResNet architecture like that. And based on that, they wanted to figure out, hey, how closely that mimics the activities of the brain. And it turns out, and this is kind of interesting, it turns out that a good brain score, in other words, a good match really led to a better accuracy for those networks. There's still a long way to go, and they showed that some ANNs are now more competitive with the human vision, but there's still a long way to go, and to really be able to come up with a good architecture that matches, let's say, in this particular case, the visual cortex of the finally, the input representations, and that plays a very, very important role in a lot of cases. And we'll see that, what kind of input coding that we do. And based on that input coding, one can potentially think of, for example, having the right kind of network architecture. So to that effect, what we wanted to focus on as an example is a completely vision-based navigation of a robot going from point A to point B, and I'll take that example to basically show how how we can optimize the sensing along with the network architecture and the hardware architecture of the. So to that effect, we'd like to look at a cross-layer design from sensors, algorithm to hardware, as I mentioned earlier. So now in this particular case, the drone, for example, has to go from point A to point B, and in order to do that, the drone has to first figure out, using its sensors, what's around it. What are the objects which are stationary? What are the objects which are moving? And based on such moving objects, they would like to track each of those objects and then plan the path to go from point A to point B. So that's the basic idea. So the next question, of course, is that, hey, what kind of sensing technology should I use? In this particular case, we actually used two types of camera. One is the standard frame-based camera that everybody uses, and then also there's a spike-based camera called the dynamic vision sensor. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but those cameras are such that when there's a relative motion between the camera and the object, there's a spike that is produced. Now, these inputs then go into a network architecture. And in this particular case, the network architecture could potentially be a standard ANN, a standard deep learning network, could be potentially an LSTM, or in fact could be a spiking neural network. So the question then, of course, is that what's the best way to select such network architecture, or should they be a hybrid of these ANNs and SNNs? And finally, these network architectures, the optimum network architecture has to be implemented in a hardware, and that hardware has to be suitable for implementation of these networks so that you can achieve the right kind of latency and the power consumption that is required. So with that in mind, let me try to focus on the sensors in this particular case. So what's the difference between the frame camera and the event camera? The frame-based camera, we are all familiar with that. It produces the frame of these images, and these frames can now potentially go to analyze it for, let's say, optical flow estimation. This is an analog neural network, and I'm showing an encoder-decoder kind of architecture that can potentially be used for optical flow estimation. Now, the problems with such cameras are that they usually have a motion blur, and the dynamic range of such cameras are not very high. On the other side of it, the frame-based cameras do produce a spike when there's a relative motion between the camera and the object. So in this particular case, as you can see, when the dot is moving fast, I'm actually producing a lot of outputs, but when there's no relative motion between the camera and the object, then of course there are no spikes which are produced. So this is an effective way and an energy efficient way of doing building a camera, and it turns out it has less of a motion blur, and the dynamic range of these cameras are pretty high. So they can actually work with objects which are fast moving objects. Now the question then, of course, is the fact that since these cameras are producing outputs and spikes, is it possible to use a spiking neural network? Now, there are some advantages of using a spiking neural network in such a scenario, because the timing between the spikes turns out to be quite important, and it gives you a lot of information about the dynamics of these environments. So if I can effectively use the timing between the spikes, then I can potentially have a network which is going to give me a better optical flow. So to that effect, and at spiking neural network, as we have noted earlier, based on the activation function, which could be leaky, integrate, and fire kind of operation, can potentially capture the membrane potential of that that camera, can potentially capture the information about the timing information. So these networks are certainly quite suitable for example, time sequences. So let's try to actually look at using such cameras for optical flow estimation as an example, and then try to see how an ANN or an SNN or a hybrid of such networks would behave when it comes to optical flow estimation. So what is an optical flow estimation? Optical flow, as we all know, that birds and insects perform complex high-speed maneuvers in cluttered environments, and so there's a need for them to have an understanding of the surrounding motion. So if I were to really look at the eye, in this particular case, I'm showing the retina of the eye and the image being actually focused on it. Turns out the idea of optical flow would be to estimate the 3D motion vectors as 2D vectors on the retinal plane. Now, as an example, estimation of this 2D motion field by computing the spatial and the temporal variation of the pixel intensity is what we do. And here's an example of two optical flows that I'm showing here. One is a sparse flow, and the other one is a dense flow. So now the question, of course, is, hey, with these cameras in mind, can I really come up with a proper optical flow architecture? So to that effect, what we wanted to look at is a fully spiking and a fully non-spiking, or an ANN kind of architecture. Both of these architectures look the same. What I'm showing here is an input to have these input channels. The input channels are, in case of a spiking network, what I can do is I can take these input spikes which are coming in from that camera. I can combine a few of those time frames together and feed it into my spiking neural network. And that network now can process it, and the membrane potential can potentially remember the past information and give me a good flow. Correspondingly, a similar architecture like ANN can also be used, where the inputs can still be spike-based inputs. And remember that we talked about this camera, which has the DVS camera, which actually provides spike inputs. They also provide the frames. So in between two frames, there could be a bunch of these spikes which are available. Let's say that between two frames there are hundreds of 100 time steps. So in that case, an ANN would possibly end up taking 50 of them together, combine it together into one channel, the next 50 to another channel, and then process it. The only problem with such processing is that sometimes, even though you are able to capture some timing information in the input, but once you combine them together in the later layers of the network, you might lose a good amount of such timing information. So it does make sense to actually use, for example, a spiking network for these kind of neural optical flow estimation. And it's certainly directly compatible with events, capture the temporal information, and certainly for training, one of the things what you have to think about is you have to combat the vanishing gradient, and that can potentially be done with some adaptive spiking neuronal model. Now, on the other side of it, this network that I just talked about, the fully spiking architecture, required about 13 million parameters for the data set that we looked at. Now, on the left side of it, I'm showing a fusion flow network where we actually ended up doing sensor fusion. In this particular case, what we did is we actually not only took the DVS camera outputs, but we also took the frame camera outputs and came up with this hybrid network. The upper part of the network on the encoder side, as you can see, is a spiking network. On the bottom one, and the encoder side is a ANN kind of network. Then you combine these outputs together into this encoder-decoder architecture to be able to come up with a sensor fused fusion flow network. It turns out, taking the best of both worlds, best world of the SNNs and the best of ANNs, turns out you can actually come up with better flow estimation in this particular case, because remember that there's information about intensity in the frames, which is absent in case of the DVS cameras. So combining these two, you can actually get a better flow. And interestingly enough, you can potentially use half the number of parameters. In this particular case, we used about 7.5 million parameters. And that actually gave us the best result, these hybrid networks. Now, we wanted to do a little more analysis and try to see that, can I really have very lightweight architectures? So to that effect, we came up with this architecture, which is a completely spiking network called the FireFlow network, potentially suitable for edge devices, and that certainly did not give us the kind of accuracy, the endpoint error that we'd like to have compared to, for example, the fusion flow network. But with 60,000 parameters, it actually gave us reasonable results. And since the number of parameters is only about 60,000, it's quite efficient and a low latency implementation suitable for fast inference. Now, we wanted to actually further carry out some more analysis of these networks and the FireFlow networks and the variants of it. We ended up using 60,000 parameters to 90,000 parameters to about all the way up to 13 million parameters that we have seen for the encoder-decoder architecture for the SNN, and we wanted to see what kind of performance can I get. And what is interesting to see, what I'm showing at the bottom is that if I were to actually look at a baseline architecture, which is this using these 13 million parameters, and if I were to really get the same kind of endpoint error, it turns out I can use a network of size about 270K and get the similar kind of performance as the baseline architecture. And the reason I'm able to do that is because that compared to an ANN, I'm able to now store these membrane potentials, which actually keeps information about the past, and effectively be able to actually do better time series, and in this particular case, optical flow. So to that effect, we believe that one can potentially, using such networks, one can potentially get a huge amount of improvement, about 48x lower number of parameters and a 51x lower number of computations compared to a completely, fully ANN kind of implementation. And one of the important things to understand is that such a network consistently outperform, similarly sized, EVFlowNet, which is basically the non-spiking version of this encoder-decoder architecture that we discussed. Now, so far I talked about optical flow. There's a need to think about segmentation. That also is important. I'm not going into the details of segmentation. It turns out a similar kind of hybrid architecture can also be quite efficient in implementing segmentation. Now let's try to look at going further. I need to be able to detect objects, track objects, and determine their movement, how they're moving. So to that effect, what we wanted to do next is look at object detection and tracking. So in this particular case, we actually directly use the DVS inputs to be able to not only detect the object, track the object, but at the same time be able to actually determine what speed the object is moving at. So what I'm showing here is basically the camera output. On the top, basically the frame camera output, and output coming from the yellow algorithm using frames. And in the bottom, I'm showing the yellow algorithms working on the events. As you can see, there's a lot of objects which are around it, and it's difficult to visualize the object which is moving. So to that effect, what we ended up doing is using is a very simple, one layer of single layer spiking neural network, which can isolate events corresponding to moving objects and then detect these objects accurately. We also use a clustering algorithm along with it. And then at the end of it, it actually gives you directly the moving objects with low latency and low energy consumption. As an example, I'm going to show a video of this algorithm, which is demonstrating the DOTI experiment, this is basically the DVS camera, and the DVS camera is focusing on this particular object, which is shown here is moving, and the target object moves at different speed. In this particular case, I'm showing slow speed. It also moves at high speed, and at the end of it, what I really wanted to show is that the speed can be captured, speed along with that particular object can be captured using the spiking neural network, and a very simple-minded one layer of spiking neural network. So now going further, what we also wanted to see is that if we can do more effectively, more effective detection of the object. So to that effect, what we wanted to see is that if we can use more bioplausible means, and it turns out in neuroscience, people talk about object detection recognition using a two-stream hypothesis, where one stream called the ventral stream is the what stream, which is used for the recognition functionality, and the dorsal stream is the stream which is for the where functionality. So to that effect, one can potentially think of the what stream to be foveation. We have in our eyes a certain area of the eye called fovea, which can focus on a particular area, that's called the glimpse. And so one modeling foveation, one can potentially think of the object that I'm looking at to be sort of in focus, and the rest of the objects around it are with much lower resolution. Here I'm basically showing 3 instances of different sizes of the glimpse for the stop sign. On the other side of it, when we try to look at different objects in a scene, our eye has a rapid eye movement, also called the saccades, and it goes around and figures out where the different objects are, again using the glimpses. So this is an example of an eye movement within 2 seconds of an observation, where in this particular case I'm showing the different objects that the eye is looking at. So the question, of course, is, can I use such mechanisms of the dorsal stream and the ventral stream to do better object recognition? And so to that effect, we actually ended up doing a dorsal stream model. Here I'm showing an image of a little girl with a dog and a cat, and the objects of interest in this particular case, turns out to be, in this particular case, 3 objects. We have a global context network determining the points of interest, and using those points of interest now, one can do proper foveation and determine what the object is. So let's look at basically the glimpse of looking at the cat in this particular case. So the extracted foveated glimpse is I'm showing here as an example. And then based on that, looking at it, one can prime the network, saying that it's basically the cat's ears with a high probability. And then what the network would like to do is move down and right. My glimpse is changing, move down and right, and then figure out, hey, it's a cat, the face of the cat's eyes, and going further down, then expanding my glimpse, I end up figuring out, hey, this is actually indeed the cat's whiskers, and this is a cat. So that's kind of the foveation that one can potentially look at. And using such network, without going into the details of the network, what we did is, for the fun of it, we tested it in our, tested the model on our group. And here I'm basically showing these different, images and what foveation in this particular case does, which is showing with the box here and the glimpse sizes to be able to recognize the object, and not only recognize, but to tell me where the objects are. And as a byproduct of this, I thought it's kind of interesting to show that one can also detect optical illusions. This is an optical illusion of where depending on where my glimpse start, it's going to be either a rabbit or a duck. So if I start my glimpse right here and expand my glimpses, I'll end up seeing a rabbit. If I expand my glimpses from here, and that's my focus point to start with, turns out it will be a duck. So as an example, I'm showing here that is an input image of a duck and a rabbit, which is this illusion that one can use. And if my glimpse starts there, which I'm showing on the right, the size of the glimpse, how it's changing based on our algorithm, one can say, hey, this is a rabbit. Whereas if my glimpse starts here, as you can see on the right side of it, my glimpse changes and says it is a rabbit. In the previous case, it was a duck. And in this particular case, we wanted to use and show an example of this vision-based navigation, that one can use optical flow, depth estimation, and really tracking the object and the speed of the object to be able to fly. This drone is supposed to fly through that ring, which is moving at a particular speed. Now, so far, again, I talked about different perception tasks, optical flow segmentations, object detection, tracking, and so on. Now, these algorithms, whether these are ANNs or spiking neural networks or hybrid networks, as I mentioned, they need to be implemented in a hardware which is efficient. So to that effect, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about implementation of these algorithms on the right kind of hardware. Now, what kind of hardware is going to be important for deep learning applications? It turns out that most of these applications, or the algorithms that we talked about, in all these cases, we end up using quite a large number of matrix vector multiplication. And on the right side, I'm showing a chart which is borrowed from IBM research, which shows that for speech, language, vision applications, and so on, it turns out that it is very important. These matrix vector multiplication, which are shown in red, are really the major operations that we end up doing. Now, so the implementations in some ways for our hardware if we can try to make these matrix vector multiplication very efficient, then potentially I can get a good amount of improvement in energy, and at the same time, maybe also latency. So to that effect, the circuits and architecture that we'd like to build not only embody the computing principles of the brain, but to be able to do near or in-memory computing. I'm not going to talk much about approximate and stochastic hardware, but these algorithms being resilient in nature, one can also potentially think of implementing those in an approximate hardware. One can potentially do event-driven computation. And finally, at the end of it, and I talked about the CMOS devices, but there are some interesting neuromorphic devices, which are non-volatile memories, that could also be used. So where are we today? Today, we use certainly multi-cores GPUs and other kinds of accelerators for these different ANNs, SNNs, and a hybrid of those architectures. But we believe that in-memory computing, along with some of the approximations of the hardware that can potentially be done, one can actually get a large amount of improvement in energy efficiency. So let's try to look at, in particular, actually the neuromorphic devices and interconnects and in-memory computing to see what kind of improvements we can potentially get. So compute in memory, in particular, one can look at memory as an array. And in general, for example, if you're familiar with cache memories, what one can do is one can actually have in particular a word line activated, and you end up reading from those from the bit lines using peripherals, which are usually sense amplifiers. Now one can also activate multiple word lines. Difficult to do in a 6T cell, but if I'm able to actually activate multiple word lines, and by changing the peripheral circuitry a little bit, it turns out I can do AND operations or operations and bitwise operations and so on. But again, going a little bit further, if I'm able to turn on multiple lines, then I actually end up doing a matrix vector multiplication on the bit lines, and that's done in an analog fashion. And since it's done in an analog fashion, it turns out the interface circuitries that I need are a little more complex because I don't want to communicate in the analog domain, so I need some sort of A to D converters and all. Now, each of these arrays can potentially be used for matrix vector multiplication, or, for example, doing digital operations. Can be done in non-volatile memories using both SRAMs or any other non-volatile memory. At the bottom, I'm showing that it's possible to implement some ROM operations or transcendental functions into these memories, and can also be able to do, for example, softmax or exponential functions, but I won't have time to go into the details of it. But it's certainly possible to do some of those transcendental functions in these memories too. Now, going into a little more details of it, here I'm showing a bunch of interesting devices. These are mostly non-volatile devices, and which can potentially be used as neurons and synapses. These are, as I say, quite colorful devices, but some of these devices are quite mature and can potentially be quite useful. I'm showing a ferroelectric transistor as a synaptic device or a neuronal device. Then I'm showing some magnetic devices, magnetic tunnel junction as a device, or, for example, or an RAM or a PCM as a memory. Now, each of those memories, they can be used as synapses or neurons. Each has its own kind of advantages and disadvantages that I'm showing here. In particular, actually, I'm looking at PCMs, RRAMs, magnetic tunnel junctions, and CMOS kind of memories. As you can see, what is really important to note here is the fact that the cell area is important. The less the cell area is, more dense the memory is going to be. And if I'm able to avoid going to the external memory DRAMs and so on for computing, for getting the data back, then I can potentially have a large advantage. But then again, the PCMs are not, doesn't have the kind of endurance that a magnetic tunnel junction or a CMOS memory has, whereas CMOS certainly is quite fast, whereas some of these non-volatile memories, the read-write times are quite a bit larger. So with that in mind, one can potentially think of doing, again, as I said, matrix vector multiplication operations quite effectively using these crossbars, where I'm showing basically a crossbar where there are the G's represents the conductances of some of these devices. And if I have an input which comes in as, which are shown as voltages, and the output I'm getting as current, turns out I can go get a summation of VI times GI using Kirchhoff's law, and that does my matrix vector or multiplication. Now, each of those devices could potentially be a PCM, RAM, a magnetic tunnel junction, or can also be, for example, a CMOS memory. Now, these architectures of the crossbars can potentially, and I'm showing a little more details of it. You have these input encoded encoding that comes into this crossbar, and based on, again, the number of crossbar, the word lines that are active, you can do matrix vector multiplication, which is going to be an analog domain in this particular case. One can also do digital. I'm not talking about it, but the output of it, since it's analog, you need some sort of a to D converters that I'm showing here at the bottom. to communicate with other units. So potentially one can think of a network on a chip kind of architecture where you have a bunch of these crossbars connected through an NOC kind of architecture, and then one can also think of an external DRAM or off-chip memory. Now, in all these architectures, I'm not going to go into the details of it. It turns out you're going to be dominated by the interface circuitry. In this particular case, the A to D converters. And the area and the energy, as I'm showing here, is going to be dominated by these A to D. So I would really go into a little more details of it, where the cores that I'm showing in this architecture are each of those matrix vector multiplication units, and along with some shared memory and receive buffers, one can potentially think of an architecture. We have different tiles, and these tiles are connected with a network on a chip kind of architecture to come up with a massively parallel accelerator, which is quite efficient for ML inference. And each of those cores, as I'm showing here, consist of these crossbars that I shown in the earlier figure. So using such an hardware, we implemented, in particular, actually the optical flow, and tried to analyze how effective such in-memory compute is for doing these computations. So the first thing that we did is for optical flow estimation, we actually did a GPU-based implementation on an NVIDIA Jetson TX2. And one of the things that I would like to underscore is that for implementing, for example, SNNs or some of these hybrid architectures, the Jetson wasn't very effective. And the kind of performance that we wanted is about 30 frames per second. In reality, after implementing it in this GPU, what we found is that we could only get about 7 to 8 frames per second. Now, going a little bit further, we implemented these in-memory computing architectures. In this particular case, I'm showing an in-memory computing CMOS-based architecture that we implemented, and which uses also sparsity as a way of like optimizing the power consumption. And it turns out for such a architecture with in-memory computing, one can achieve now a good amount of improvement in terms of the number of frames that you operate per second. It was up to about 35 to 40 frames per second. Now, this was actually for an ANN. It turns out one can also use an SNN for such computing. And for SNN, the things are going to be, the SNN architecture is slightly different from the ANN architecture because of the fact that one has to now look at the membrane potential. You have to update the membrane potential every time the input comes in. And if I'm able to do that updating of membrane potential in memory, then one can again get an improvement in performance. So to that effect, I'm showing an SNN accelerator that we also developed, and using such an accelerator, again, it was possible to get about 40 frames per second implementation done in a 65 nanometer technology. Finally, what I also wanted to show is that this is a simulation results that we looked at, a simulation of and in-memory computing architecture, but in this particular case, we used RRAM as the device of choice for doing in-memory computing. And it turns out, in this particular case, we were able to get a large improvement. As I mentioned earlier, that the ADCs played a very, very important role in determining the performance of these designs. So if I can somehow get rid of the ADC, then I can potentially get a large improvement. Unfortunately, if you just blindly get rid of the ADC, then your performance would suffer quite a bit. So what we had to do is we had to do some sort of an optimization, in particular actually quantization of the bit lines, as I showed earlier, and quantization of the partial sums. And if I'm able to do quantization of the partial sums and using that quantization during my training to understand that quantization during my training, it turns out I can actually get my accuracy back. So using such approaches, which is basically using the hardware in the training loop, one can actually now get rid of the ADC and do that same optical flow. And this time we were able to achieve about 75 frames per second. And again, this is the simulation results that we have. So here are some parting thoughts. I really believe that hybrid sensing and hybrid networks um, can potentially lead to a large improvement for the class of applications that we looked at, and in terms of both accuracy, energy efficiency, and robustness. Some of these hybrid networks are actually quite good because of the fact they can take the best of the two worlds. One is the ANN world, which actually can give you better, easier training, along with the fact that SNNs can potentially actually capture the timing information. Well, a combination of these two can potentially lead to large improvement. Such networks are quite interesting and has a good potential for edge computing, both for training and inference. I didn't get to talk much about it, but I feel that the underlying devices are going to play quite an important role in developing the right kind of hardware architecture. So in-memory computing with some of these neuromimetic devices can effectively harness the synapse and neuron functionality quite well and lead to a large improvement in energy consumption. So at the end of it, certainly we are developing these new algorithms, but there's a need for an energy efficient hardware, and taking advantage of that is going to be quite important. So at the end of it, I believe that algorithm hardware co-design guided by biological principles can be a pathway for next generation of neural computing. Thank you.